There's something about first-person pixel RPGs that modern, realistic games just don't replicate. The grainy visuals, the oppressive atmosphere. These aren't retro gimmicks or nostalgia bait. They're ambitious, strange, and often uncompromising RPGs that blend classic dungeon crawling with modern design sensibilities. And somehow, despite how good they are, they're still wildly underrated. Wizardom sits at the intersection of boomer shooter energy and old-school RPG design, blending fast-paced first-person action with exploration and progression that feel distinctly retro. It doesn't fully commit to traditional RPG structure, but the way it handles growth, secrets, and world interaction earns it a place among pixel RPGs worth talking about. Combat is immediate and satisfying. Spells feel powerful. Enemies are aggressive, and movement is quick, encouraging constant motion rather than cautious inching forward. But unlike pure shooters, it rewards exploration just as much as combat. Hidden areas, alternate paths, and secret upgrades are everywhere, encouraging players to scour each level thoroughly. Progression is lightweight but meaningful. Instead of overwhelming stat systems, the game focuses on expanding your magical toolkit and survivability, letting skill and awareness do most of the heavy lifting. Difficulty ramps up steadily, pushing players to master movement and spell usage rather than rely on raw numbers. Visually, this embraces chunky pixel art and vibrant color palettes that give it a playful but dangerous tone. It feels energetic without becoming chaotic, maintaining a balance between speed and control. Wizardom might not appeal to players looking for deep narrative or complex RPG systems, but for those who enjoy first-person exploration mixed with arcadey combat and light progression, it's a surprisingly addictive experience that deserves more attention. Delver is one of those games that looks simple at a glance, but slowly reveals just how tense and absorbing it can be. At its core, it's a first-person dungeon crawler with roguelike structure, but the way it blends exploration, atmosphere, and risk makes it feel far more deliberate than its minimalist presentation suggests. Every run drops you into a dark, hostile dungeon where visibility is limited, resources are scarce, and death is always just a few bad decisions away. There's no hand-holding here. You learn enemy behaviors through experience, figure out when to fight or flee, and constantly weigh the risk of pushing deeper against the safety of retreating. That tension is Delver's biggest strength. Combat is straightforward but punishing. Timing, spacing, and awareness matter more than stats, especially early on. Magic, melee, and ranged options all exist, but none of them turn you into a power fantasy. You're fragile, and the game never lets you forget it. Finding new gear or spells feels earned because survival is never guaranteed. What elevates is its atmosphere and aesthetic. The lighting, sound design, and enemy placement create a constant sense of unease. Even familiar rooms feel dangerous when you're low on health, and hear something moving just out of sight. It captures that classic dungeon crawling fear that modern games often smooth over. It may not have a sprawling narrative or massive world, but Delver excels at making every moment count. For fans of first-person RPGs who enjoy tension, discovery, and learning through failure, it's a quiet classic that deserves far more recognition. Islands of the Caliph feels like stepping into a forgotten corner of RPG history, one that blends classic dungeon crawling with an aesthetic and cultural influence you rarely see in the genre. Inspired by early CRPGs and Middle Eastern folklore, the game immediately stands out not just visually, but tonally. Exploration is deliberate and methodical. The world is dense with secrets, shortcuts, and hidden threats, rewarding players who take their time and map things out mentally. There are no flashy cutscenes or constant guidance systems. Instead, progression comes from paying attention to dialogue, to environmental cues, and to how the world subtly reacts to your presence. Combat leans more toward survival than power fantasy. Enemies are dangerous, healing is limited, and reckless movement is often punished. You're encouraged to think before engaging, manage resources carefully, and sometimes avoid conflict altogether. It's a design philosophy that feels old school in the best way, trusting players to learn through experience rather than tutorials. What really elevates it is its atmosphere. The architecture, music, and storytelling draw heavily from cultural influences rarely explored in RPGs, giving the game a distinct identity. Instead of relying on grim darkness alone, it balances mystery, beauty, and danger in a way that feels fresh despite its retro foundation. It's not a game built for instant gratification, but for players who enjoy slow, thoughtful exploration and worlds that feel genuinely different. Islands of the Caliph is a hidden gem that deserves far more attention. Legends of Amberland 2 feels like a love letter to classic 90s first-person RPGs, the kind that lived in thick manuals and expected you to figure things out on your own. It wears its old-school DNA proudly, but it's not just nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It's carefully designed to recreate that sense of long-form adventure that modern RPGs often skip. Instead of focusing on a single hero, the game gives you a full party to manage, each member contributing to combat, exploration, and survival. Dungeons are sprawling and methodical, requiring careful navigation, resource management, and an understanding of enemy patterns. It's the kind of game where mapping the world in your head becomes part of the experience. Combat is turn-based but deceptively deep. Positioning, party composition, and spell timing all matter, especially as enemies grow more dangerous and encounters start punishing sloppy preparation. There's no rushing through fights. Every battle asks you to think before you act. What really makes it stand out is its sense of scale. The world feels vast, filled with secrets, optional areas, and side paths that reward curiosity. It doesn't bombard you with cutscenes or exposition. Instead, it trusts the player to engage with its systems and slowly uncover its depth. It may look simple, but it's built with intent. For players who miss the feeling of getting lost in a classic dungeon crawler and slowly mastering its rules, Legends of Amberland 2 is far more compelling than its modest presentation suggests. Labyrinth of the Demon King feels like a lost PS1 survival RPG that somehow escaped into the modern era. It blends first-person dungeon crawling with oppressive horror, minimal guidance, and a constant sense that you're wildly underprepared for what's ahead. From the very beginning, the game makes it clear that confidence will get you killed. The labyrinth itself is the star. Corridors twist back on themselves. Rooms feel deliberately hostile, and navigation becomes a mental exercise rather than a mechanical one. There's no map holding your hand, no quest logs spelling things out. You survive by learning the space, remembering landmarks, and slowly building an internal understanding of how the dungeon breathes and shifts. Combat is slow, deliberate, and punishing. Enemies aren't just obstacles, they're threats that demand respect. Swing timing matters, stamina matters, and panic almost always leads to death. The game actively discourages reckless aggression, pushing players toward patience, spacing, and sometimes outright avoidance. What really sets it apart is its tone. The visuals are gritty and intentionally uncomfortable, paired with sound design that keeps you constantly on edge. Silence is just as unsettling as noise. The game doesn't rely on jump scares. It builds dread through anticipation and isolation. It's not a welcoming RPG. Progress is slow, death is frequent, and answers are scarce. But for players who love oppressive dungeon crawlers and horror-leaning RPGs that respect intelligence over convenience, this one leaves a lasting impression. Vero is one of the most minimalist RPGs on this list, but don't let its simplicity fool you. Beneath the stripped-down visuals is a tightly designed experience built around tension, precision, and careful decision-making. The game places you in a dark, abstract labyrinth where every movement feels intentional. There's no clutter, no excess systems, and no hand-holding. Instead, this focuses on fundamentals, positioning, timing, and understanding enemy behavior. Each encounter feels like a small puzzle rather than a test of raw stats. Progression is subtle but meaningful. Rather than overwhelming you with numbers and loot, it rewards mastery of its mechanics. Learning when to engage, when to retreat, and how to exploit small advantages becomes the real path to success. The difficulty curve is steep but fair. Failure usually teaches you something important. Atmosphere is built through restraint. Sparse sound design, limited color palettes, and deliberate pacing create a sense of isolation that lingers. The game doesn't explain its world or story directly, leaving players to infer meaning from context and tone. Vero won't appeal to everyone, especially players looking for traditional RPG structure or narrative exposition. But for those who appreciate focused design and immersive minimalism, it's a quietly brilliant experience that proves you don't need complexity to create depth.
It's the cruel reality of Yar.
Blood West takes the familiar idea of a Western and twists it into something deeply wrong. Set in a cursed frontier plagued by supernatural horrors, it blends immersive sim design with first-person RPG mechanics in a way that feels both methodical and tense. Combat emphasizes stealth, positioning, and preparation rather than reflex shooting. Ammo is limited, enemies are deadly, and rushing into fights almost always ends badly. The game encourages slow, deliberate movement, scouting areas, setting traps, and choosing when to engage or avoid conflict entirely. Exploration is where this truly shines. Levels are open and layered, with multiple paths, hidden areas, and environmental storytelling that rewards curiosity. Notes, visuals, and subtle details hint at what happened to this world without spelling everything out. The more you explore, the more unsettling the setting becomes. Progression allows meaningful customization, letting players lean into different playstyles like stealth-focused builds, ranged combat, or survival-oriented approaches. Each choice has trade-offs, reinforcing the game's emphasis on caution and planning. Visually, Blood West leans into gritty pixel art that enhances its oppressive tone. Combined with eerie sound design and sparse music, the game creates an atmosphere that feels constantly threatening. It's not fast-paced or flashy, but it's deeply immersive, the kind of RPG that pulls you in by making every decision feel dangerous and consequential. Northern Journey is less of a traditional RPG and more of a haunting, exploratory odyssey, but its systems, progression, and sense of discovery earn it a place here. Set in a surreal, Nordic-inspired wilderness, the game drops you into an environment that feels ancient, lonely, and deeply uncanny. Exploration is the core experience. Vast snowy landscapes, ruined structures, and strange creatures create a world that feels both beautiful and threatening. There's a constant sense of being watched, even when nothing is happening. The game thrives on mood, using environmental storytelling rather than explicit narrative to draw players in. Combat is simple but dangerous. Weapons feel heavy, enemies are unpredictable, and encounters often feel more like desperate struggles than heroic victories. Progression comes not just from upgrades, but from learning how the world behaves, which areas are safe, which creatures to avoid, and when to press forward versus retreat. What makes Northern Journey special is its atmosphere. The soundtrack, sound effects, and visual composition work together to create a sense of isolation that's almost meditative. It's eerie without being overtly scary, unsettling without relying on horror tropes. It's not a fast game, and it's not designed to appeal to everyone. But for players who value immersion, mood, and exploration over traditional RPG structure, this is unforgettable. The kind of experience that sticks with you long after you stop playing. Morta is one of those games that feels like it crawled out of an old shareware CD and decided to stay weird on purpose. At a glance, it looks like a crude, low-resolution dungeon crawler, but that rough exterior hides a game that's deeply intentional about discomfort, unpredictability, and psychological pressure. The world feels hostile from the moment you step into it. There's very little onboarding, minimal explanation, and a constant sense that you're not supposed to feel safe. Environments are claustrophobic, enemy encounters are sudden and brutal, and the game frequently withholds information that would make things easier. That design choice won't appeal to everyone, but creates an atmosphere that's genuinely unsettling. Combat is simple but unforgiving. Positioning matters, timing matters, and mistakes are punished quickly. There's no power fantasy here. Even when you grow stronger, the game makes sure you never feel fully in control. Resource management becomes a survival skill rather than a background mechanic, forcing careful planning and restraint. What really sets it apart is its tone. The visuals, sound design, and pacing all work together to create a sense of dread that feels more psychological than mechanical. It doesn't rely on jump scares or overt horror tropes. Instead, it builds anxiety through isolation, ambiguity, and a constant feeling that something is off. Morta isn't trying to be accessible or broadly appealing. It's a game for players who enjoy being uncomfortable, who like piecing together meaning from fragments, and who appreciate RPGs that challenge expectations rather than fulfill them. Lunacid is pure atmosphere, inspired heavily by games like King's Field and Shadow Tower. It drops you into a decaying underground world where silence is just as threatening as the monsters lurking in the dark. From the moment you take control, the game makes it clear that discovery, not combat, is the core experience. Movement is slow and deliberate, encouraging careful exploration rather than reckless engagement. The environments feel ancient and oppressive, filled with forgotten ruins, hidden passages, and subtle visual storytelling. There's a constant sense that the world existed long before you arrived, and will continue long after you're gone. Progression is flexible, allowing players to specialize in magic, melee, or hybrid builds without forcing rigid classes. Spells feel powerful but risky, and equipment choices significantly impact survivability. Combat can be punishing early on, especially if you wander somewhere you're not prepared for, but the game never outright blocks you from doing so. That freedom creates tension and encourages experimentation. What makes this stand out is how much it trusts the player. There are no quest markers, no intrusive UI elements, and minimal explanation. You learn by observing, failing, and slowly understanding the rules of the world. The soundtrack, sparse but haunting, amplifies the sense of isolation and dread. It's not flashy, and it's not fast, but Lunacid captures a kind of immersion that few modern RPGs even attempt. The feeling of being completely alone in a hostile, mysterious place, armed only with curiosity and stubborn determination. Dread Delusion feels like a fever dream version of a classic Elder Scrolls game filtered through late 90s PC RPG design. At first glance, its low-poly visuals might seem simple, but they hide a world that's dense, unsettling, and surprisingly reactive to player choice. The floating islands setting immediately sets it apart, creating a sense of instability that mirrors the game's tone perfectly. What really defines this is its commitment to player freedom. Quests don't funnel you toward obvious outcomes. Decisions often have delayed consequences, and the game rarely tells you whether you made the right choice. Factions are morally ambiguous. Information is unreliable, and exploration often leads to discoveries that feel forbidden rather than rewarding. Combat is intentionally rough around the edges, leaning more toward survival than power fantasy. Enemies are dangerous early on, resources are scarce, and progression feels earned rather than guaranteed. That roughness turns some players away, but it's also what gives the game its tension. You're not meant to feel comfortable here. The writing leans into dark fantasy and cosmic horror without over-explaining itself. Lore is uncovered through fragments, conversations, and environmental storytelling, encouraging curiosity instead of exposition dumps. It's not a fast game, and it doesn't hold your hand, but that's exactly why it works. Dread Delusion feels like a world you're trespassing in, and that sense of unease is what makes it unforgettable.